So I've been asked to, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a pleasure to be here in Oslo. Thank you. And I've been asked to, this is the title of my presentation, which I realize is a bit tabloid journalism, if you like, exaggerating the issue a bit in the way that they do often. And we're going to explore issues around these from the perspective of the Horn of Africa. So let's go straight in. I'm going to look at the movement a little bit, some generic trends, some of the protection risks, the criminal opportunity, which is really the migrant economy, which is critical. We live in a globalized world. We need to rethink some of the drivers and some of the contradictions. Let's look at the migrant perspectives and the non-migrant perspectives a bit, and then look at some definitions, and finally some thorny questions. I've got 45 minutes, 45 minutes, but I may not take all that time. So quickly, something interesting about the Horn of Africa is that people leave in all directions. The one everyone's very interested in is here, but in fact, there are a lot of people going north through Egypt and previously into Israel until they completely sealed their border early in 2013. But even so, about 4,000 Eritreans are leaving, they estimate, every month, for example. Going east, which is the area we focus on a lot, into Yemen, and they're not really going to Yemen, they're going to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Peninsula. We've seen about 6,000 per month on average over the last 9 years. 80% of those are Ethiopian. Going south to South Africa, not such high numbers, but the same group, Somalian, Ethiopian. And obviously that's been disrupted a lot by recent xenophobic or Afrophobic attacks that have been going on down there, which have actually been going on quite a few years and has slowly been reducing the number of Somalis in particular going down, making the Ethiopians going south the more numerous group now. And finally, the one that is bothering Europe so much is Horn of Africans coming through, and others obviously coming through Sudan, Libya, and crossing into Europe. I think the estimate last year is that 20% were from Horn of Africa, which would make it around 44,000. Looking at some generic trends, what we've been seeing over the last few years, is that it's more complex. We've got multiple drivers going on, which is why we call it mixed migration, mixed irregular migration. So we've got regular and irregular, forced and economic, and other groups, trafficked people as well, all mixed in these movements that are more or less being handled by, but not exclusively, by smugglers. There's rising vulnerability. More exploited, not just by criminals and criminal groups, but also local communities, state officials all over the place are profiting massively from the sort of unbridled flow of migrants and people on the move, whether they be refugees or economic migrants. So, that's an interesting point because it's growing in number, as we know, but it's independent of specific crises. So take example the drought in Somalia in 2011, 2012, causing a large group of people to move into Kenya and into Yemen. When the drought ended, we didn't see a big reduction in the group going to Yemen at all. So the same number were moving. So we're seeing movement. Let's say Ethiopia isn't at war, doesn't have massive drought. It has other problems, overpopulation. There is sort of lack of political freedom and expression there, and soil infertility and things like that may be causing movement. But we're not seeing the movement being directly related to crises when it's mixed migration. Obviously, refugee movement, for example, Burundians right now are moving in direct response to the instability there. But in the general flows going out in the four directions, we're not seeing it related to crises necessarily. Less toleration around everywhere. I'll come on to that later. It's a high profit and low risk business model for smugglers and traffickers. At the same time, we're seeing quite a lot of confusion how to respond. Exactly as you say, it's a complex issue. There's non-harmonized policies in place, or they're not being implemented, or they're being breached. That's just as true in Europe as it is in East Africa, with all the different protocols about permitting movement of people. And there's little understanding, although it's increasing, about the scale, scope, and conditions of mixed migration and the dynamics of mixed migration. And the dynamics are what interest us so much. And more people are understanding the scale, scope, and conditions because it's become such a hot issue and high on the agenda. Let's look quickly at some of the protection challenges. If it's not a humanitarian crisis, which I realize is the title of this meeting, then certainly it's a human rights crisis. It'd be interesting to know how it is a humanitarian crisis. Certainly we view it as a human rights crisis. Because what we're seeing is that on top of the high-risking behavior taken by migrants, we're seeing these categories that are greatly affecting their human rights, if you like, and their vulnerability. The commoditization of migrants in recent years. They're literally being treated as commodities, being sold from one gang to another, being expendable, as commodities may be, basically just commodities in an industry that is billion-dollar industry now, if you take the north of Africa and Europe. Criminalization of migrants. We see a lot more migrants in detention and being criminalized. As criminalized, instead of administrative law, they're coming under criminal law, particularly in East Africa and I think in other parts. We're also seeing criminalization of the smuggling culture that was previously much more consensual and less violent, and it's become more criminalized with traffickers and extortionists, criminal gangs getting involved. And we're seeing massive collusion and corruption by state officials. There's no way that these people can move anywhere without total involvement by state officials, everywhere. And that includes in parts of Europe as well. They are the lubricant, they are the oxygen, if you like, of the whole migrant industry. It seems to have stuck. Oh, there we are. Yeah, there's some confusion and cynicism concerning asylum, refugees, and other migrants now. The currency of refugee regime is under threat and under stress. I think everyone in this room knows that. As long as we have mixed flows, we're going to see that only increase. And skepticism and, if you like, cynicism around genuine refugees and asylum seekers is going to increase. And I think we've seen that all happen. So that's how their protection challenges are one of the major protection challenges for genuine refugees and asylum seekers. And finally, sorry for those at the back, it says the commercial power of smuggling and trafficking. I think, is Ruben here? Sorry, are you going to talk about the economics of migrant? Right, so I'll just do, there's just one quick slide then, that just have some indicative estimates of the figures that we've put together. Perhaps the one that's most interesting is this one by an author who put it as 300 to 600 million euro last year was the money being made. Although interestingly, the Migrant Policy Institute in 2010 claimed the crossing of the Med was worth 2.6 billion. And there's some other ones there. What's interesting to me is that a lot of the money being made is in some of the most remote and porous parts of the world. So if you think these are quite large sums, you need to multiply it by about 100 to get an impression of what the power that has in the local economy. Maybe 100 is too high, but certainly by many factors, to understand what power that has in the local economy, and how in some of these places it is the economy of the port or the area or the towns along a certain route. And therefore very entrenched, and therefore involving many state officials, and very permitted and not regarded necessarily as illegal or negative at all. And quite the opposite in many communities. In Yemen, we also have an issue of hundreds, if not thousands, every year, girls completely disappearing off the radar. Female migrants who arrive on the shores there and disappear. And there must be a whole trafficking industry there that's been under-examined, and the Yemen government certainly isn't paying any attention to it. And there must be millions of dollars involved in that as well. On top of that, these don't include the extortion levels. A lot of migrants are being extorted en route. So that's separate from the fees they pay. And studies that came out the last 2 years have shown that possibly €500 million was extracted between 2007 and 2012 from Eritreans that were kidnapped and tortured in the Sinai. Again, many people in this room will know about that terrible caseload. So we live in a globalized world. We've got we've got widening gulfs. I mean, it's quite frightening times we live in, and if you look at the range of division, if you like, that exists in the world. But there are some big bridges, and the big bridges are the ones that relate to migration. We have globalized communication, critical. Satellite TV, social networking, massively used by smugglers and migrants alike, and refugees, asylum seekers. People are seeing the other side of the world, if you like, through MTV, through all the films they watch, through streaming, through telephone communication, proximity with relatives in the diaspora. Globalized communication is a really critical link in why, what we believe is why migration is rising so fast at the moment. Again, globalized transportation. I mean, it may not look like it with these sort of little fishing boats coming across, but in fact, it's not just fishing boats that people are using. People are using ships and aircraft and trains and vehicles, trains, buses, cars, everywhere. I mean, the amount of roads and infrastructure that allow people to move rapidly ahead of the police, as if the police would stop them anyway. So globalized transportation makes everything far more possible. And then globalized crime. There are numerous studies showing how crime is always many steps ahead of crime prevention, international crime, and they're doing very well on this business of human smuggling and human trafficking, as we know. For example, just a 250,000 of UK passports are lost every year, let alone any forgeries. So you imagine that in all the European countries, how many there are passports floating around for sale for people who want to buy them. And these are the richer migrants that we don't generally see because they don't end up on the boats or don't end up dead on the shores. So getting caught up in mixed migration flows means getting caught up in the dark side of migration. This is the intersection between globalization and international crime. But what's interesting is also that studies show that relative income disparity is more disturbing to people than absolute income disparity. So global inequality is high, but unlike before, people are seeing it and they're feeling it, and they want maybe the possibilities that they're seeing and hearing about more immediately. So obviously geography and climate and rough seas are no respecter of status. When I talk about status here, I'm talking about the status between an economic migrant or an asylum seeker or a refugee. And the facilitators and exploiters of those on the move are also no respecter of status. They treat refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants and trafficked people the same. So, sorry, again at the back. In this context, it may be misguided to think that poverty eradication and sustainable development, both very slow, will reduce current mixed migration flows from sub-Saharan Africa, especially from the Horn. And this is pretty critical because in most international conferences and debates, the issue of poverty eradication and sustainable development continues to be the root cause of people's movement. And I think we think in RMMS, it's very important to widen the examination of this. And so we're going to look at some rethinking of drivers right now. Let's look at some push factors. Obviously, a lot of them are overlapping and interwoven. There's the obvious ones of poverty and conflict, environmental stress, resource competition. We've got a young population, high fertility that doesn't look as though it's going down very soon. A lot of unequal distribution. This is in the global south, if you like, and particularly the Horn of Africa. We've got governance issues. A lot of the states are quite predatory. They're certainly chaotic and disorganized. Poor health facilities, poor education, and more critically, poor education returns, meaning what parents invest in education, they don't see returned in the incomes that people get, partly because salaries are so low. We've got underemployment as well as underemployment. We've got limited democracy, all these absences, a lot of intolerance. There's traditional harmful practices people want to run away from, tribalism, marginalization, and corruption, crime. And last one, aspiration and adventurism. And this is an important one. It's going to appear in the next list, which is, of course, a sort of corollary to the first list, which is pull factors. So here, a very interesting study in Britain 2 years ago, a quick one on the streets of London, asked migrants if they had to choose one word, what was it that they loved about being in England or in Britain? And it was freedom. It wasn't money, it wasn't jobs, it wasn't being with, it was freedom. So I think we often underestimate the cultures that we offer migrants beyond just the jobs and the away from their own violence in their own countries. It's freedom, political and personal freedom that many have never experienced before they come to Europe. There's also a rights-based social system and justice system, rule of law. Obviously, the opportunities and jobs, education, salaries. Diaspora is quite important when there's an existing community to come into. Organized, reliable state structures. All these things that act as a really interesting pull factor for many people. Aging population, so there's lots of opportunities. We've got low fertility in Europe. Obviously security, and again, aspirations and adventurism. I think we shouldn't underestimate, as I said, the power of that for a lot of the young men, and they are generally young men coming, you know, as I probably would do exactly the same in their situation. You know, the idea of going to Europe or going somewhere better. It's a big adventure. There are risks, but it's fascinating and almost irresistible. And your aspirations are permanently being fed by success stories of people who've made it. But, so in the last decade, we've seen a lot of transformation in the Horn of Africa. We've got pretty buoyant and growing economies in those countries. You might look at the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and see that Horn of Africa doesn't do that well. But relatively speaking, it's doing very well. It's in the last 10 years, country by country, historically speaking, it's been transformed. So if the conditions and opportunities were worse 2 decades ago, and if there are more jobs than the economic boom in the 80s and 90s, why are we seeing such a rise of economic migrants at the moment? And not only that, but if it is just poverty and economic opportunities, then why don't we see poor Kenyans, Djiboutians, Ugandans, Tanzanians, and other groups in the flows? Why are the flows so narrowed down to a few countries? Eritrea, yes, a very oppressive regime, but Ethiopia, oppressive to some, but not for others. In fact, it's economic boom at the moment. And Somalia, of course, has been there for 20 years with its problems. But if it's just poverty, we should be seeing other people. And why, too, is there not much more south-to-south migration in the region if it's just economic migration and refuge-seeking behavior? So we see culture of migration as set in, but not uniformly. And I just thought this, I mean, it's a very obvious fact, but if you look at this UN-sponsored World Happiness Report, which is very multi-indicator built, you know, obviously, you know, migrants seem to be coming from the bottom 20% of that ranking and going to the top 20%. You'd be happy to know Norway's way up there, I think, with Iceland as one of the top 2 or 3 in the world. So there's a lot of cynicism. And the complexity of the situation has led to a lot of knee-jerk reactions. Knee-jerk, I didn't mean that in a pejorative sense, but maybe unreflected in reactions of the European response to the drownings and the deaths. This is actually a cartoon from 2 years ago. There's another one. But the truth is, there are contradictions and there are different voices. So we've got, if you like, the liberals on the right wing. We're using terms like hard right to describe anybody who is sort of wants to be reflective or careful about the numbers coming in or allowed to come in. And as a result, it's been becoming a divisive and top agenda issue. We've got a widespread call for rescue, but at the same time, in the countries listed there, we're seeing very strong anti-migrant feelings and expressed politically as well through different political groups. It's interesting, if you take UK, for example, I mean, I could add many other countries to this list, but the last 3 or 4 are obviously related to what's going on now in Indonesia. But it is interesting, in the recent election in England, the Conservatives won, but as you may know, Britain doesn't have proportional representation in its system. But if it did, UKIP, which is a very anti-migrant group, and its main agenda is anti-migrant, would have 83 seats, which is half of the total Labour vote. They got 4 million votes, which is 13% vote. But because we don't have proportional representation, they ended up with 1 seat. That may please some people in this room, and myself, but it does indicate that the importance of this subject to the Brits and to other maybe parallel to other countries in Europe and Norway. how important this subject is, and we can't ignore it. At the same time, an OECD report last year, that was looking towards 2050 said that Europe and USA needed 1 million migrants every year if it was to maintain its economic situation, growth, its way of life. What do we do with that information? At the same time, sub-Saharan population, 900 million now, could be 4 billion by the end of the century. It's part of the world with the highest fertility, I believe, than any other part. Does this feed into this? But then what about this? Same time, IOM and now EU want to see 20,000 resettlement places shared across Europe. That's going to be one of those, I think, very contentious issues that you mentioned earlier. And so on the other side, we've got Italians saying there's another 1 million would-be migrants in Libya waiting. That's not IOM, that's the International Maritime Organization, claim that there's 500,000 that will come this year, and they're expecting at least 10,000 deaths. So I think we've got 2,000, almost 2,000 deaths now. We've got another 5 times that figure to expect, if that prediction is correct. On the other hand, we've got migration transition theory, some of you may know about, and it's looking at migration down through history, and it shows that actually increased prosperity increases migration in the short and medium term. So I'll come on to that in a minute. So is this a flash in the pan? Are we in this age of migration as part of the modern global transformation? We've got a situation of asylum versus security. ISIL are claiming they intend to send 50,000 fighters to Europe through these channels. A smuggler on the BBC a couple of days ago said they're already sending fighters, and they extract 10% tax from the smugglers in Libya at the moment. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's certainly what we're hearing increasingly. No wonder some countries are viewing this as a major security threat as well. And perhaps the contradictions at the moment are epitomized by the call for rescue on one hand, as you said, primary motive is to rescue lives. But at the same time, there was a unanimous vote on late last week to create a naval blockade of smugglers on the Libyan coast. So in terms of reality check, let's look at an optimistic scenario coming back to East of Africa, Eastern Horn. IGAD, by the way, is the East Africa bloc that includes Djibouti and Eritrea and Ethiopia, Kenya. And so because of migration theory, we know that even if in the most optimistic scenario, we should expect an increase in people wanting to leave that region. If we go to a less optimistic scenario, where we see regional conflict, environmental stress, development inequality, and governance problems, which perhaps are more likely than the optimistic scenario, we'll also see migrants increasing. So the root causes are not always desperation. The pull factors are also very compelling. And as long as refugee status and asylum is available elsewhere, refugees will move with the migratory flows. So let's look at the migrants' perspective. They make their own risk assessments, just as anybody would. Take a young person. He may try to settle in his country, but he finds he cannot, and he can't make a future. So he pins his hope on going to Europe or elsewhere. There are others that don't even bother. They don't even try to settle. They've started dreaming about going to Europe from a young age. A lot of their colleagues and friends at late school and university, or tertiary education anyway, are moving off right away. They've got dreams, aspirations, they're feeling adventurous, pretty fearless, risk-taking. We did a study of knowledge, attitudes, and practices of Ethiopian migrants in the Horn of Africa. And we found that they were extremely aware of all the risks that they face. From rape, including mass rape, to robbery, to death, to abduction, to abandonment, to thirst, dying of thirst or starvation en route, any of those above. They were very aware of the risks, and they were still engaging the smugglers to move. How many times have we heard, "I'd prepare to die than to return home"? We see repeated attempts. They only have to succeed once. And they've got time. There's nothing else happening in their lives as far as they're concerned. There's no opportunity cost. They can just keep on trying. On the contrary, it's the value of them getting to Europe is huge, and however many months or years it takes them. This is the perspective we're seeing. Anyway, look at the risk. Deaths in the Med last year. The death rate was only 1.6%. I say only, guardedly. And so far this year, it's 3.8%. And in May, one weekend, there were 6,000 that crossed, and only 10 were found dead. That's a 98.4 success rate. That's pretty good odds if you're a betting person and you're a young man thinking, I want to try this. All those odds look pretty good. And anyway, the smugglers don't care. The deaths and abuse don't affect their business model at all. There seems to be an endless supply. By the way, crossing to Yemen from the Horn of Africa is a 0.2% risk. There is a particular reason for that, though. The deaths came right down when they started holding migrants for ransom very successfully in Yemen. So now a migrant arriving alive on the shores of Yemen is more valuable than a corpse, and because they sell them to the criminal groups. So that's also why we saw a big reduction in the deaths in Yemen in the last 2 years. They also have soft landings from their point of view. There's an existing African community in most of the countries in Europe where they're going. Profiling is publicly unacceptable. So it's easy to live under the radar, especially in cities. No one's going to ask them any questions unless they get into trouble. There are active NGOs, civil society organizations that support migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. There's all kinds of protocols, conventions, laws, protecting the rights and offer chances for appeal. This is from their perspective. You may disagree, but this is their perspective. Once they're here, right at the bottom it says 39% of rejected asylum seekers in Europe in 2015, sorry, that should be 2014, were not returned. Again, from their perspective, very good odds. So from the 55% of people who were rejected last year, only 39%, sorry, only 61% were returned. 39% slipped into Europe and are presumably still here now. So again, the odds are very good from their perspective. Let's look at our perspective, if you like, or non-migrant perspective. They are stretching definitions and challenges and our assumptions. If we consider this changing environment, we too are very challenged by the concept of mixed migration. A lot of people here probably spent many years working with refugee law and asylum seeker policies and issues. But I think we're all being challenged by what we're seeing now. Sorry, that's not a very good picture. So what do we see when we see a bunch of people on a boat like this? What are they? Well, this gent, who's doing quite well. Most migrants would see him as a dream fixer. He's a business. He thinks of himself as a successful businessman. He probably thinks he's looking after his family, and that's the best thing he can do. See, all kinds of terminology is now being bandied around about these people who are on the move. Nomads pastoralists in Kenya, for example. Are these going to be future migrants? Who's this woman? Is she a sex slave? Maybe she's just a domestic worker, a businesswoman, stranded, victim of trafficking. I think we're all struggling with the definitions that we've been brought up to understand and the conventions we've been taught to respect in this current flow of mixed migrants from the Horn of Africa and everywhere else. So I'm just going to end with some thorny questions. So if the push-pull factors are considered, it will be increasingly difficult to stop migration, despite the fact that we can expect a major collision between rising migration and policies of the North. Is it correct to say that because they take the risks, they must be desperate, and what they're fleeing is so bad that they should be treated as refugees? What we may regard as high risk, they may say as low risk. Should the failure of developing countries to establish national systems of their own constitute a humanitarian crisis for Europe? Will opening the borders solve this issue? People focusing on the idea that supply and demand of European economics will define how many migrants will be here and shouldn't be here. Maybe it's not enough. When we look at the perceived benefits of simply being in Europe, from the migrant's perspective, even unemployed. Must the closing of legal avenues for entry into Europe automatically mean illegal methods will thrive? In the current climate, yes, but look at Australia's no-boats policy. On land, we are also seeing fences built between Greece and Turkey and Bulgaria, and around Spanish enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. This isn't necessarily our position. I'm just throwing out some questions. Will legalizing and organizing migrants reduce smugglers' predatory hold on the trade? Can we legalize enough migrants to satisfy demand? Is Europe a victim of its own success and now caught up in its own standards and norms of rights, values, ethics, and therefore tortured over the current migrant crisis? Last page. Has Europe been too permissive? It's a free-for-all. Are Europeans being taken advantage of? This is what we're hearing from smugglers. They're telling migrants, potential migrants in West Africa, go now. It's chaos in Europe, and this is a chance of a lifetime. You're going to get in, because they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what to do with us. We're too many. That's what we're hearing. I know this was a very contentious issue last year at the rescue, at the dialogue, the UNHCR dialogue meeting about, it was completely taboo to suggest that the rescue boats were a big pull factor. Now I hear a lot more people are talking about it as a potential pull factor. As I mentioned, even though, anyway, the point I made earlier about the migration policy cannot be in contradiction to the labour market, or else the pressures will be too much. Is it inevitable that Europe has to develop a more open migration policy? And so is migration the unfinished business of capitalism, as somebody, I think, from ODI in London suggested in a recent article? That basically it's inevitable. If capitalism is to continue in Europe, we have to bring migrants in, and therefore we have to open the borders and change our policies. It seems like there is a unified and strong response, or there is one developing at the moment, controlling migration. Let's see if that works. Interestingly, and possibly cynically, could Australia's tough approach to migrants work in Europe as a humanitarian response, i.e., as I think, what's his name? Rudd, the Premier of Australia. Tony Abbott. The only way to stop the deaths is to stop the boats. And do migrants have the right to gain access to Europe by virtue of having got themselves onto the Med waters? Is this a fair system? Doesn't it reward the smugglers and reward the most able or courageous or foolhardy of those wanting to access Europe? What about all the others who didn't take the road to Europe but have equal claim to the same asylum seeking or refugee justifications for their situation? And finally, will our failure to enact a more robust response now merely create conditions where people of Europe and politicians will demand a more extreme response in the future? Will it be too late then? Will extremism, social disruption, racism, and even terrorism be some of the outcomes? So finally, it's not mixed migration, it's migration. It was just such a good picture. There was one with some zebras in it, but that would have been mixed migration. But so finally, is mixed and irregular migration the new global mobility paradigm that we're facing? So this isn't a small issue that we're dealing with today. It's something that is part of a transforming, modernizing world. Thank you for your attention. I hope that wasn't too long. Thank you.